Hi everyone, today we're going to do a PowerPoint covering Chapter 1, which goes from Paleolithic times through the Neolithic Revolution and into the first civilizations of the world. So we start at the beginning of human history. Homo sapiens, like modern day humans like us, emerged in Africa, and they had a larger brain than other early hominids or human-like creatures. A key thing to know from this slide is that they started in Africa and then spread out throughout the rest of the world. So you can see on this map, they spread through Europe, the Middle East, Asia, down into Southeast Asia, and then eventually over to the Americas through the land bridge that connects what is today Russia with Alaska. So developed in Africa, spread throughout the world over time. So the first people, or Paleolithic humans, were nomadic hunter-gatherers. So what they did for a living is they hunted and followed animal herds to be able to hunt them, or they gathered plants and different things that were in the area where they were. Paleolithic means Old Stone Age. So Paleolithic, Neolithic. Paleolithic is first. It means Old Stone Age. Neolithic means New Stone Age. And they're nomadic, which again means that they moved around to follow the animal herds to hunt. So the most important discoveries or inventions of Paleolithic people were fire and stone tools. So people learned how to make fire when they wanted it to occur, and they made stone tools. So there's an example here on the bottom left of stone tools, and they may not look like much to us today, but people learned how to shape rocks to do different things, such as dig, break down animal carcasses, hammer, things like that. Fire would be useful for a number of different things: warmth, cooking, light. And one important thing to note about Paleolithic people is that their tools and innovations were geographically specific. So think about this for a minute. What tools might you develop if you lived in Alaska versus the Mediterranean? So in the Mediterranean, it's warmer. Think about that. You live right on a body of water, the Mediterranean Sea, specific species to that area, versus Alaska, where it's much colder. You probably also are doing a lot of fishing, but different species. And so the point here is that people took the resources that they had in their environment and made tools and clothing and shelter to fit that environment. Paleolithic people did develop art, so even though they did not have writing at this time, we do have some things left behind from them. Cave paintings are an example, so you can see in this scene it's depicting a hunt, which makes sense because that was something that was crucial to their survival, so they would choose to depict that in their art. Politically, which means government, the Paleolithic people were organized into small groups around kinship, which is like extended family. Multiple kinship groups that may have moved together to follow the animal herds are called clans. So they didn't have a formal government like we think of today, but generally the elders, the oldest people in the group, would kind of be looked at to make decisions. They were not necessarily self-sufficient. So there is evidence that some Paleolithic people traded. We know when people trade if archaeologists find resources in a place where those resources are not native. So if they can't be found there naturally, people had to have traded for them from somewhere else. Also in Paleolithic times, we have the beginning of spiritual beliefs to explain the world. There's two really important terms here that you need to know. Animism, which is belief in spirits of nature. So this means that other things in nature, animals, even natural things like mountains, rivers, for example, have their own spirits. And then another key term is shaman. A shaman is a person believed to have special abilities to cure the sick and influence the future. So sometimes we call people who believe in this shamanistic. So if you think of a term that we don't really use anymore, but like a medicine man or something like that, somebody who's it's believed has special powers and rituals to cure people, sometimes tell the future, things like that. Another really important thing to note is that there's less socioeconomic separation than in later times. Socio, meaning social classes, Economic, meaning your social class based on your economic situation. So think about in our society, like wealthier people versus poorer people and how that impacts their social status. All right, now there's not that much of that going on in Paleolithic times. So there's a question here. Why do you think nomadic people had less social stratification than later people living in cities? Well, really, it's because they don't have that many possessions. They're moving around all the time to hunt, and so they don't carry that much stuff with them. Think about today. A lot of how we determine somebody's social class, like just by kind of observing them, would be based on the things they have. Like what kind of house do they have? What kind of car do they drive? What kind of clothing are they wearing? All of those things somewhat impact what kind of class people perceive you to be. And so in the nomadic times, when people don't have all of those things, they have very little possessions, there's just not that much separation between people in terms of social classes. So if we look at gender in Paleolithic times, gender is something we're going to talk about all throughout this year and how gender roles change. So men and women in Paleolithic times were considered pretty equal. That does not mean that they had the same job, because they don't. But throughout history, where we're going to see that men often were considered higher than women in a lot of societies, that was not the case in Paleolithic times, even though men and women did different things. So men were generally responsible for hunting and fishing and defense. Women gathered plants, made medicines, and were responsible for childcare. And there's a reason that women did those particular things. Women at this time breastfed their children for a lot longer than a lot of people do today. And so they had to have their children near them. And when you have young children, it's harder to, go on a hunt or something like that. And so women gathered food around the area where the family was camped. And then medicines were made from plants at that time, and a lot still are today. And so they were responsible for that too. Because both of those tasks that men and women did were vital to the survival of the group, one was not seen as more important than another. And so that's why we have a lot more gender equality in this time. Okay, so how did we transition from that, being nomadic hunter-gatherers in Paleolithic times, to the Neolithic Revolution and starting to farm? Well, there was climate change at this time. So Paleolithic people lived during an ice age. And so as the ice and the glaciers melted due to natural processes of the earth, the climate started to warm up. And so that allowed people to start farming. Agriculture was discovered just through trial and error by accident, probably by women, because they're the ones that did the gathering of the plants. And so what happened probably is that people over time just realized sometimes when seeds fall to the ground, new plants sprout up, and they realized that they could do this purposefully and start to farm. And so once people were able to farm and grow their own food in one place, that's when we have humans staying in one place and not migrating around as much for the first time ever in history. So this event is called the Neolithic Revolution, and there's a definition here. It's the change from hunting and gathering to systematic agriculture and domestication of animals. Systematic agriculture means, systematic meaning on purpose. And then domestication of animals means we're going to keep animals as tame animals, like not just wild animals that we're going to chase around and hunt. We're going to keep the animals to raise them for food, for their hides, things like that. And so people started with animals that already lived in herds naturally, like goats and sheep. And then farming probably first developed in Mesopotamia, which is in the Middle East, about 10,000 years ago from today. And like I said, farming developed slowly through trial and error and discovery, and then spread to other regions. So this map shows you how agriculture most likely spread. It most likely developed in the Middle East with plants that already grew wild there, like wheat, barley, and beans, and then diffused as people moved around. You can see throughout Europe, throughout Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia, all different places. And you can see on this map, it tells you the different plants that were domesticated in different places. Those were things that were already growing wild there. So like Southeast Asia, bananas and rice were already growing there, and people learned how to grow them themselves. Now, if you look at this map, there's one place in the world where people had to make or discover agriculture on their own. And that is in the Americas. Because by this time, the people from the Americas who ended up in the Americas had probably already traveled over that land bridge from Asia into the Americas and were probably cut off from the rest of the world. Because remember that the Ice Age had ended, and so ice was melting, sea levels rose, and that land bridge was closed off. So in the Americas, people had to discover this all on their own, and then it diffused throughout to different civilizations in the Americas. So this is just another important point. One thing that we're going to talk about over and over in Chapter 1 is that people are entirely dependent on their geography. Everything they do depends on their geography, where they are, what the temperature and climate is like, what resources they have. So people domesticated animals and plants, just like I said on the last slide, that were already wild in their region. So wheat in the Middle East, rice in Southeast Asia, corn or maize in Mesoamerica, which is like Central America. Okay, so this whole discovery of farming starts a chain reaction that leads to civilization. So follow through this with me. Once people learn to farm and they grow food, they no longer have to chase the animal herds because they have a stable food source, they can stay in one place. That leads to the first time ever people settle into villages. As those villages grow larger and people become better at farming, they grow into cities. The key thing that the Neolithic Revolution provides is a food surplus. So think about it this way. If we were sitting in class, I would tell you to imagine this. We have a class in here. With farming now, one person in the class probably can farm and grow enough food to feed everybody else in the class. So now, everybody else in the class can go do other things. They're freed up to have other jobs. When we go back to Paleolithic times, everybody in the group is focused on getting food, hunting and gathering. There's not really time or need for people to go do all these other things. Now that we have farming and one person can grow food for many, many people, people are freed up to do other jobs. And that's what we call specialization of labor. So it's because of farming that we have a food surplus that frees up people to have other jobs. Once we have other jobs and people start producing products, like out of metal, making baskets, making pottery, all different kinds of things, people start to trade. People always naturally trade when they want to get things that they don't have. So in this region, if we don't have this certain precious stone or precious metal, we want it, we see it somewhere else, we want it, we trade with those people for something that we have that they don't have. And this leads directly to civilization. So just to show you how effective farming was in terms of supporting a population, there was a huge population increase as a result of the Neolithic Revolution. So before the Neolithic Revolution, there were probably 5 to 8 million people on the earth, and by 4000 BCE, which is really before a civilization even starts, there were 60 to 70 million people. So farming, providing that stable food source, led to a huge growth in population. That does not mean that this is perfect, and there are definite downsides to a civilization, which we'll talk about. So what this slide is really saying is, again, this key theme of geography. What people do in the Neolithic time period is directly dependent on their environment. So what kind of tools they make, what kind of weapons they can make, what kind of homes they build, foods they eat, clothing that they create. All of this is determined by what resources are available and what they need to survive. Now, they carry over their political organization initially from Paleolithic times. Initially, they're ruled by a council of elders, but over time, that power starts to centralize in the power of just one person, which we'll talk about. So in the beginning of Neolithic times, society stayed very close like they were in Paleolithic times. So there were a lot of shared resources. So things like ovens, fields, storage buildings for grain, working together to clear land and build irrigation systems. All of those things happened communally. Like initially, when people started farming, it wasn't like we see today where we're going to, build a fence. This is my field. This is your field. The whole community worked together to accomplish these things. And private property was initially limited to just personal possessions like your clothing and just a few limited items. So possessions were often linked to survival. and food storage. So clay pottery and woven baskets developed to store food. Wool and linen clothing. Those are significant because wool and linen, you have to get animal hair, turn it into thread, and then weave it into cloth. So that's a new process, whereas previously people used animal skins mostly. More advanced tools and weapons made from metal. Plows were developed. So there's this huge growth of invention. Now that people have a stable food source, and again, we have specialization of labor, it frees people up to create new things. As agriculture led to larger and more stable settlements, more organization became necessary. And they are all, again, is evidence of trade from this time as archaeologists find resources in a place where they're not native to that place. So these are the major characteristics of civilization that we're going to talk about. Most civilizations have these things. You can still be a civilization without these things, but it's just like a framework that we use to help us kind of talk about different civilizations and compare them. So most civilizations have cities, organized central governments, more complex religions, social classes, job specialization in the arts, and writing. An example of a civilization that doesn't have all these things are the Incas of South America. They did not have writing. They are still a civilization. So again, it's not like a hard and fast definition. So we're going to go through and talk about each of those characteristics in a little more detail. So the earliest cities tended to develop near rivers, and there's a lot of reasons why cities and civilizations develop near rivers. Obviously, we need water to survive. It also helps with transportation and communication because you can sail up and down a river. It also helps with trade. Challenges would be flooding. So today we have a lot of different ways to control where water goes. At this time, they had to invent all of that. And so most of these rivers would flood in a rainier season and cover the land with water. And so they had to develop ways to deal with that. Irrigation developed. That's one of the important inventions of Neolithic people to be able to control the water. An early irrigation could be very simple. It could be just digging a ditch like you see in the bottom picture here to control where the water goes and direct it toward the fields where you want it. This is also one of the reasons that government developed to help organize people to build projects like irrigation. So as more and more people are living together in a place now that's going to be a city, we need some sort of organization because there's going to be disputes. People are going to commit crimes. We want to survive as a civilization, so we just need some kind of organization. So government developed to control labor, to control the storage of food and dispersion of food to people, and to mediate disputes and keep order. A lot of early governments were centered around priests or religious leaders, warriors, or kings. We'll talk about that. Eventually, governments became more and more complex and gained new responsibilities, such as tax collection, lawmaking, public works, which is like any kind of public building projects, like building roads, building government buildings, ways to control water, all of that. And then military organization. Now, if there's going to be different civilizations, we're going to have conflicts and need to defend ourselves. So all of those things became important aspects of government. The next one is complex religion. So almost all early civilizations had a polytheistic religion where they believed in many gods. And the gods tended to represent nature or were thought to control human activities. The priest class developed. Priests were people who were thought to be able to communicate better with the gods than just the average person. And so priests had a lot of power in society because people thought the gods were really controlling everything, and it was very important to keep the gods happy. Priests generally did this through different rituals and sacrifices. And one of the ways that the priests had power is that they were the people who knew those rituals and sacrifices and could perform them. A lot of times they were secretive, and ordinary people didn't have access to that information. Early kings regarded themselves as gods or representatives of gods. This is very important because most early civilizations, their ruler had power because the people thought that he was either a god or a direct representative of the god. An example that I like to use, because people generally already know this, is the pharaohs of Egypt, were at times worshipped as gods themselves on earth or as representatives of the gods. There's one major exception to this, which are the Hebrews of the Middle East. And so the Hebrews are the people, or sometimes called the Israelites. In history terms, we usually call them the Hebrews, developed the first monotheistic religion ever, which is Judaism, which we'll talk about. So they're definitely different or unique from the other civilizations at the time. Another key term to note here is monumental architecture. Monumental architecture just means really big buildings. So monumental architecture developed to connect with religious beliefs. So in early civilizations, when they build really, really big stuff like the pyramids of Egypt, it's generally connected to religion. So religion, arts, government, it's all connected. The pyramids of Egypt, for example, I'm sure a lot of you know that they are the tombs or the final resting place of a lot of the pharaohs. This is because the Egyptians believed that in the afterlife, after you die, you need to take not only your body, but all your possessions with you so that you'll have them in the afterlife. And so they built these huge structures to house that. And so that's a direct connection between architecture and their religious beliefs. And you may also know that the pyramids were actually from the oldest times in Egyptian history. That's because they were frequently robbed. And so people knew that there were the pharaoh in there, all his possessions, a lot of gold and wealth, and so they broke in and stole things because it's sort of like a big arrow, like there's a lot of expensive things in here. And so later pharaohs, like King Tut, were buried in secret tombs where people couldn't find them to keep all their possessions and so they wouldn't be robbed. So with specialization of labor that occurred as a result of agriculture, we also have the beginning of social classes. Social classes, social hierarchy, social stratification, all are terms that represent the idea that there's a few wealthy people at the top, and then we kind of go down from there in a pyramid, pretty much, through different social classes. And so people tend to be ranked according to their profession and according to their wealth. So, for example, priests are generally at the top of the social structure in this time period because they can talk to the gods and ordinary people can't. Aristocrats or warriors control the weapons, other people don't. Aristocrats are people who own land, and that helps generate their wealth. Common people do the work, the manual labor. Slaves have nothing. In this time period, slaves are generally people who are captured as prisoners of war. Slavery in this time period is generally not hereditary like we think of in United States history. Okay, so what are elites? Elites are people at the top of the social structure. Who would have been the elites in these early societies? It would have been the priests and generally the aristocrats, again, who are people who own land, and that provides them wealth. So a little more about job specialization. One key term that you need to know is an artisan. A lot of times students think an artisan is somebody who makes art, and that could be true. But an artisan is just anybody who makes a product. So somebody who produces something by hand, which is what everything was produced by hand in this time period. So people who make bricks, people who make things out of metal, people who weave baskets or cloth, those are all artisans. Also, once we have job specialization and we start to have civilization, we have the production of luxuries as society moves past subsistence. So subsistence, remember, is just having enough for survival. Like if you talk about subsistence farming, it's just farming enough to feed your family. Now that we have a stable food source and there's a lot of food to go around generally, people can spend time making things that we don't even need to survive, that are just things that we want, like say jewelry made out of precious metals or precious stones. And so that also increases social stratification, or like defines the different social classes, because people who are wealthy and can afford those things now have a higher status than people who are poor and cannot afford those things. We also have the development of metal technology. Bronze is the first major metal to be developed into different products. Bronze is a mixture of metals. And then later people transitioned to iron, which was harder and more durable. Again, with the arts, monumental architecture was often tied to religion, So we see here different temples throughout the world. These large structures were generally organized by the government for a religious purpose. All right, next on to writing. So writing was probably first used by priests and developed to keep some sort of records, whether it would be religious records, government records, records about food, anything like that. The earliest writing used pictographs or pictures to represent different words. And symbols were added to represent words and then sounds. This also led to the development of another specialized job, which is called a scribe. So a scribe is someone who's trained to read and write and record information. This is specialized because in this time period, they didn't have an alphabet initially. Like when you learn to read and write, you only have to learn 26 letters. In this time period, they had to learn thousands and thousands of symbols or pictures. And so it took a lot of training, and so it became a pretty high-status job to be a scribe. The first writing system is considered to be cuneiform in Mesopotamia, which is on the bottom left. Other writing systems like hieroglyphics in Egypt, Chinese calligraphy developed, and the very first alphabet was later developed by the Phoenicians in the Middle East. So cuneiform is generally considered, again, to be the first writing system, which you see in the bottom left. All right, another key theme we're going to talk about all this year is the environmental impact of humans. And so humans, with the advent of farming, definitely impacted their environment. Soil erosion. So this occurred from both farming and grazing animals because once people started clearing land in order to farm, the soil, when it rained, they could run off more easily. The same thing with grazing animals. If you graze too many animals in one field, and they eat away the vegetation, water comes and washes the soil away. Other problems that would occur with intensive farming over time would be soil depletion. So you probably know if you farm the same crop over and over in the same area, it's going to deplete specific nutrients from the soil and it's going to become less productive over time. One thing to keep in mind, even though we're talking a lot about civilization, civilization is not inevitable from the Neolithic Revolution. So there are a lot of people and a lot of places in the world that stayed nomadic for thousands of years, and there are even people that are still nomadic now. One key term is pastoral nomads. So pastoral nomads are people who are animal herders, kind of like shepherds, where they move around to find food for their animals. So these are people that remained nomadic even after civilizations formed. One of the key things about pastoral nomads is that they help spread technology, because as they moved from city to city with their animal herds, as they learned about new things, they told people about those things in other places. They also had an impact on geography. Sometimes their animal herds overgrazed, and so that led to soil erosion, just like farming. So the second part of this PowerPoint is about the specific early civilizations. There are 4 major river valley civilizations that you see here. Mesopotamia is in the Middle East. Egypt along the Nile River in North Africa. The Indus River Valley, which is in what is today Pakistan mostly. And then China, which we call the Huang He. There are others that we're going to learn about, but those are the 4 major ones. All right, so Mesopotamia is located in the Middle East between 2 rivers called the Tigris and Euphrates. It also has some other nicknames. The Fertile Crescent, if you look at the map, the area between the rivers is sort of shaped like a crescent, this very fertile area, so that's why we call it that. Also the Cradle of Civilization. When we call something the cradle of something, it's like its birth, and this is considered generally to be the first civilization. So why did civilization start here? Well, these 2 rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, frequently flooded. And as the rivers flooded, they left behind silt, or little particles that had a lot of nutrients that fertilized the soil. And so this became a good place for farming. It also had a relatively warm climate. The Sumerians are the first people to settle in Mesopotamia. They migrated there and settled between 5000 and 4000 BCE. So the Sumerians were divided into independent city-states. A city-state is a city with its surrounding countryside. So it's like a city that's its own country. The point here is that Mesopotamia was not united as one place, the Sumerians had individual little cities, states that were like their own countries. The government of the Sumerians was a theocracy, which means government by religion, and they were led by a king who was considered a god on earth. The kings were also military leaders, and they built huge stone walls around their cities for protection. The Sumerians were also polytheistic, so they believed in many gods. Each city had a stepped temple on top of a ziggurat, which is what you see here. So a ziggurat is like a stepped building with a temple on top. And on the left is an illustration of one, and then on the right are the ruins of one today. So their government, their king was seen as a god. He organized building projects such as a temple, which also shows their artistic activity through their architecture. So all of those things are connected. The people in Mesopotamia relied on the flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to fertilize the soil and help with farming. The flooding was unpredictable in Mesopotamia, and so the Sumerians had to develop irrigation techniques to control the water, like digging ditches and building dams and things like that. The food surplus that was created through farming led to specialization of labor and social classes, and so they traded a lot with other civilizations because they were developing all these new products due to specialization of labor. Mesopotamia was patriarchal. Patriarchy or patriarchal means society is dominated by men. So that is a really important term you must know. And pretty much all the early civilizations, for the most part, were patriarchal. Their social classes were based on money and occupation. So you don't necessarily need to write them all down, but just kind of take a look here. The king is at the top. Remember, the king in Mesopotamia was seen as a god or representatives of the gods. Priests, government officials, aristocracy. Aristocracy, again, are wealthy landowners. Then merchants and artisans, then farmers, then servants and slaves. So notice it's defined by the person's occupation and also how much wealth they have, how high they are on the social structure. The Sumerians also developed the first writing system in the world, which is called cuneiform. Like I talked about in the earlier part of the PowerPoint, they did not have an alphabet, so there were thousands of symbols that someone needed to learn to be able to read and write. And so scribes were a very specialized and important job, and so that's why scribes had a relatively high status in society. The way the Mesopotamians used cuneiform is that they typically carved it into wet clay and then let the clay dry, and then they had a tablet which they would use. These were usually records for the government, records of financial transactions, important things that the priests needed to remember, generally things like that. One of the things that happened in Mesopotamia is that it was invaded continuously, and this is because it's a pretty flat piece of land. It does not have a lot of natural boundaries. Like there's not a lot of mountains for protection or anything like that. And so these are just some of the Mesopotamian groups that came through. The Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Persians, etc. So you don't necessarily need to know all of those groups, but you kind of, if you see one of them, should recognize that it's from Mesopotamia. And the fact that they started trading, they had specialization of labor, and started accumulating wealth led directly to warfare and also new technology, because they wanted to get things that the other people had and take over their land, which was fertile and things like that. It also led to people trying to develop better weapons so that they would be able to overtake others. So one key example that you need to know are the Hittites, who are one of these Mesopotamian groups. They're considered one of the first to adequately use iron weapons to be able to conquer others. At the bottom here are some other examples of early weapons from this time period that you can put down. So the composite bow and arrow, iron spears, chariots or wheeled vehicles, and then horseback riding. All of those are new techniques or inventions that people developed in order to conquer others. And here's just an illustration of the Hittites. You can see they're utilizing some of those different inventions. Iron spears, They have a chariot here. They also have armor made out of iron. And you can see the Hittite Empire on this map is the white area. So they came in and conquered part of Mesopotamia again through the use of their advanced weapons, especially iron. Another key civilization that you need to know in Mesopotamia are the Babylonians, or Babylon. So they invaded Mesopotamia and built a huge empire. They are most known for one of the world's first law codes, which was made by this guy, King Hammurabi. And we're actually going to look at that in class later this week and look at some of what was included in that law code and how that relates to their early societies. If you look at this picture on the right, this is actually a close-up of one of the remaining Hammurabi codes where we see the cuneiform carved into the stone. And these would be carved on big pillars and put throughout the empire so that people could, there was like a public record of the laws and punishments. So one of the first law codes. Another key civilization around this region are the Phoenicians. If you look at the map, if you see on the far eastern part of the Mediterranean, that red area, that's where the Phoenicians lived. So there's two significant things to know about them. Number one, they had the first alphabet. It had 22 letters. This, over time, evolved into the alphabet that we use today. This is much simpler than something like cuneiform or hieroglyphics because it's only 22 letters, and then you reorganize those to make all the words, versus learning thousands of symbols like in those other systems. The second thing you need to know about them is that they established sea trade routes and colonies throughout the Mediterranean. So they're really knowledgeable on sailing, and so you can see their trade routes outlined on the map and the different cities where they established colonies. Then the last other civilization you need to know in the Middle East are the Hebrews or Israelites. So I mentioned them earlier. They are unique among the early civilizations because they're the only ones that are monotheistic. And so they developed the religion of Judaism, first monotheistic religion. We are going to look at that later this week too and look at the 10 Commandments as an example. So if you look at this map, you see the Fertile Crescent shape there. And then right along the Mediterranean, in the shaded area, are where the Hebrews originated. So here are just some kind of a summary of some of the major achievements of Mesopotamia. First writing, first wheel or wheeled vehicles, number system. They developed metalworking, bronze, and then later iron. One of the first codes of law, plows, some of the first literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and lots of other things too. Next, we're going to move on to ancient Egypt. So Egypt is a civilization that developed along the Nile River in Africa. The Nile is the longest river in the world, and the people in ancient Egypt especially use the delta, or the fan-like part that reaches the Mediterranean Sea, for farming. So farming, we know, first originated probably in Mesopotamia, which is relatively close to Egypt, and so it diffused there through cultural diffusion. One difference between Mesopotamia and Egypt as a civilization is that Egypt has a lot of natural boundaries. It has deserts on one side, mountains on one side, rapids on its river, and so really the only place that Egypt is open to attack is from the north, from the Mediterranean Sea. And so as a result, unlike Mesopotamia, where they had many different civilizations over time, Egypt was a very long-lasting civilization. Also, they relied on the flooding of their river for farming. They developed irrigation to deal with the flooding, just like in Mesopotamia. And also similar to Mesopotamia, they worshipped gods of nature. So the history of Egypt officially began around 3100 BCE, when Upper and Lower Egypt were united and created the first Egyptian dynasty. Dynasty is a key word you should know. A dynasty is just when a title, such as king or pharaoh, is passed down through a family. The pharaoh of Egypt is the political and religious leader. So we talked about that in the earlier slides, about how a lot of these earlier civilizations combined both political and religious power. So the pharaoh is the political leader, he's the king, but also he's a religious leader because he's seen as a god on earth to be worshipped. Egypt also had a bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is a really key term. So a definition, administrative organization that helped rule and carry out orders. Here's how I like to explain that to students to make it a little easier to understand. A bureaucracy is just the people in the government who actually kind of do the work. So for example, say the pharaoh decrees or makes a new law and issues a new tax on people. The pharaoh is not going to go around to everybody's house and collect that tax. He's the leader. He has lots of other things to do. The bureaucracy, or the people who work in the government, are going to be responsible for figuring out how much do people owe, collecting that money, that sort of thing. So they're the people that actually kind of do the work of the government. That is the bureaucracy. So the Egyptians were also polytheistic. They had lots of gods associated with nature and heavenly bodies like the sun. The flooding of the Nile, unlike in Mesopotamia, was predictable. And so the Nile to the Egyptians symbolized new life. Another really important god was the sun god Ra. And if you think about why the sun would be an important god, it kind of makes sense because the Nile, really important for farming, the sun, equally important for farming. So here are the Egyptian social classes, and I would not say that you need to write these down, but what I want you to notice here is that we have a social pyramid. This is also called a social hierarchy. When we have people divided into classes like this, it's also called social stratification. Notice too that these social classes are very similar to what we just looked at in Mesopotamia, and that's going to be the case for a lot of these civilizations. So again, you don't really need to write these down, but note at the top we have a pharaoh who's a god king. We have government officials and scribes as being kind of more prestigious positions. Just like in Mesopotamia, we have merchants and artisans in the middle, and then common people, farmers, and then slaves at the bottom. So let's talk about gender roles. In Egypt, the man was the head of the family, so it is patriarchal. Women are in charge of the home and in charge of the children. They definitely had more freedom than in some other societies at this time. So women, for example, could make contracts and own property, which women in Mesopotamia generally could not. And there are examples of wealthy women who sometimes gain power through their families. So for example, there are 4 women who became pharaohs in Egypt. Hatshepsut and Cleopatra are probably the most famous. So what I don't want you to think here is that the average Egyptian woman had a lot of rights, because she did not. But in a case where the woman already had a very powerful and wealthy family, sometimes she was also able to have influence. So next is Egyptian arts and writing. So hieroglyphics are the system of writing that the ancient Egyptians had that uses pictures and symbols. So like I talked about in the earlier part of the PowerPoint, this is a very complex system with thousands of different symbols. The Egyptians initially carved a lot of their hieroglyphics into stone and then later onto papyrus, which is not paper, but it's kind of similar to paper. It's made from reeds woven together. Artists in Egypt were supposed to follow specific traditional styles. And so a lot of times you see what's called a composite view, where we see people almost in some ways from the front, like their shoulders are facing us, but their head is usually in profile. We also have examples of monumental architecture in Egypt, which includes the pyramids, which we already discussed. So other things that the Egyptians did besides those that we already mentioned, we know that they definitely had to have an advanced knowledge of math, including geometry, to build something as huge as the pyramids. And this is actually a picture of a man standing on one of the steps of the pyramid, so you can get an idea of the scale. They developed a 365-day calendar. They developed the practice of embalming or preserving a dead body, so that's where we get mummies from. And we know that they had to have had some medical knowledge, because archaeologists have found mummies that were clearly treated for injuries, such as broken bones or different diseases. So we can tell like the person healed before they actually died, and they were treated for their ailments. The next one is the Indus River Valley civilization. This is the first civilization in India. Another term for this, we call it just Indus Valley, or we call it Harappan. And it developed along the Indus River, mostly in what is today Pakistan. The Indus River Valley civilization had two very large cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, with populations up to 40,000, which today is not a very large city, but if you think about this is about 5,000 years ago, that's a very large city. The ruins of these cities we know are laid out in grid patterns, so the streets are parallel and perpendicular. What does this say about their government? Well, it definitely says that they had to have had a pretty well-organized government. Because if you just let people kind of do their own thing and build wherever, it's definitely not going to be laid out in a grid. You have to have rules, regulations, people to enforce them, all kinds of things in place in order to develop a city that was this well organized. They also had sewer systems, so they used pipes that kind of used gravity underground to carry waste out of people's homes and out of the city. They had walls of protection built around their cities, public wells for people to get water. A lot of their buildings used kiln dried bricks, which is where they make bricks out of mud or clay and fire them in a kiln to harden them. And they do have a written language. Now, one of the reasons we know the least about this civilization of any of these major ones is that their written language has never been deciphered by historians. So we have evidence of it, but we can't read it, and so we can't interpret their records and know more about them at this time. So here are some images that demonstrate what I was just talking about. You have the Indus Valley flowing just northwest of India. And on the right side, you have a map that shows you Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. On the bottom left, you have an illustration of what their city looked like. And this is like a cutaway. So it cuts away the street so you can kind of see the sewer system flowing underneath. And then the other two pictures represent archaeological ruins that have been found of these cities. You can see the round part in one of these images that was probably a public well. So this is where our information about this civilization comes from, again, because we have not deciphered their writing. So over time, the Harappan civilization weakened, and historians don't really know why. It could be natural disaster, or they depleted their soil. We're not really sure. But one thing that definitely happened is that over time they were invaded by a group called the Aryans. The Aryans were nomadic people who lived northwest of India who came into this region and invaded. Now, I'd like to just pause and talk about the word Aryan. Some people have heard the word Aryan before in reference to Nazis and Hitler and Aryan race and things like that. It's very associated with white supremacy today. That is not at all what the word means here. That's a word that Nazis kind of took and made it mean that. In this case, it just means people who speak a certain type of language. So if you've heard that connotation before, I don't want you to think that that's in any way related specifically to this. All right, so the Aryans came in and invaded. Even though they were in a lot of ways less advanced, they didn't have farming and things like that, they were able to take over through the use of iron weapons, and they set up a class structure that eventually evolved into the caste system, which hopefully you learned about in geography or in a different class, with themselves at the top and the Harappan people below. The other thing they brought with them that's really important is beliefs that later evolved into the religion of Hinduism. So two things again, they set up a class structure, which became the caste system, and they brought a religion that eventually became Hinduism. Over time, the Aryans developed the Sanskrit language, which was turned into writing. And so their religion, which we call the Vedic religion at this time, plus the written record of like their songs and stories about those religious beliefs, eventually became the basis of the religion of Hinduism. So when we're talking about this time period, back in the River Valley time period, we refer to it as the Vedic religion. So if you see that, it's, for our purposes, we're going to say it's the same as Hinduism, okay? But in this time period, it's referred to as the Vedic religion because it's still developing. And there's two examples of literature from this time, one of which we'll look at sometime in class this week. The Vedas, which are a collection of Aryan hymns, poems, and stories, and the Upanishads, which are stories that involve some of the key beliefs that we know as part of Hinduism, such as karma, reincarnation, and Brahman. So we'll learn more about Hinduism as a religion very soon, but it developed in this civilization from Aryan beliefs. All right, the last of the 4 major river valley civilizations is ancient China, which we call Huanghe or Huanghe. The first civilization developed along the Huanghe River, so that's why we call it that. Now, China, our study of China throughout the year is going to be organized into dynasties. That's how the Chinese pretty much organize their history. And so in this early time period, we have 3 dynasties. The first one is the Xia, which is, there's kind of debate over whether this is a real dynasty or it's just sort of legend, but we don't have written records from that dynasty, and so we're not going to worry about it that much for this class. The Shang is the early farming society, similar to like what's going on in Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. All right, so the Shang was mostly a farming society that developed along the Huanghe River. The next one is the Zhou. So if you look at this word, it looks like Zhao, but it's actually pronounced Zhou. This is the longest of all the Chinese dynasties ever in history, and they began the mandate of heaven idea, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide. Okay, so there's a lot of words here. What you may want to do is listen and then summarize after I talk about this. So the rulers of China under the Zhou dynasty claimed that they ruled under the mandate of heaven. Let's break down that phrase. If we look at mandate, mandate is to give power or authority. That's what mandate means. Of heaven, so heaven in this case representing the gods that they believe in. All right, so this put together is basically saying that the ruler has been given power or authority from heaven or from the gods. So what the Chinese believed in this time period was that heaven or supernatural forces kept order in society through the chosen ruler. The ruler was ruled by a mandate, or he ruled by a mandate or authority directly from the gods. So therefore, if he's representing the gods and is given power from the gods, he is supposed to rule with efficiency. He's supposed to be fair, basically be a good leader, have good morals, that sort of thing. And the ruler is supposed to rule according to the Tao or the Way, which is like the universal force they believe underlies everything in the world. So it's the ruler's job to be a good ruler, keep the gods happy. If the gods were not pleased with the ruler, like maybe he started becoming corrupt, he wasted money, he treated people unfairly, anything like that, the people might think that he had lost the mandate of heaven and that the gods were displeased. Also, if things happened like, say, flooding or famine, the people often attributed that to the gods too, and so they may think that the ruler has lost the mandate. Like the gods are no longer pleased with him, and so they need to overthrow him and establish a new ruler or a new dynasty, all right? So again, the mandate of heaven, very simply, is that the Chinese leader gets his power or authority from the gods, and he has to rule according to their wishes. So the Chinese believed in supernatural forces. One of the things that they did to try to communicate with their gods was the use of oracle bones. Oracle bones, an oracle is like a fortune teller or person who can communicate with the supernatural world. And so what they would do is you go to an oracle and say you have a question, like you're a leader and you're going to go into battle and you want to know what's going to happen. Are you going to be victorious? And so you'd go to the oracle would write your question on the bone, heat it up on a fire until it cracked, and then they believed that the oracle could interpret the cracks and give you an answer as to what was going to happen. And so this may sound kind of strange to us today, a lot of us, but I think it's similar to things that are still around today, such as palm reading or reading tea leaves or things like that. So it's this idea that there are certain people in society that have this more deeper connection to the spiritual world and can communicate with those spirits. They also believed, along with that the spirits of their ancestors were very important. So they believed once you die, your spirit still existed, and those spirits commingled with the gods. And so people who had already passed on, their spirits were closer to the gods than people here on earth, and they could talk to the gods more easily. And so ancestor veneration was very important to the Chinese. Veneration means to honor or revere. So they did rituals and sacrifices to the spirits of their ancestors to try to keep those spirits happy and looking favorably on the people, because they thought if that happened, then the spirits could communicate with the gods and get good things to happen for them on earth. So the last part here, we're going to just touch on a few civilizations that we're not going to delve as deeply into as those other ones that we just discussed, but we need to know that they existed and just a little bit about them. So although we were talking about Afro-Eurasia there in the rest of the PowerPoint, civilization was developing in the Americas as well. In the Americas, civilization did not always develop along rivers. Sometimes it was on lakes or on the coastlines. And there were two major centers of civilization in the Americas: Mesoamerica, which is Mexico and Central America, and then the Andes Mountains region, which is mostly in Peru and some other South American countries. These places, like I mentioned in the earlier part of the PowerPoint, developed farming independently from the rest of the world. So by this time, they were totally cut off from Afro-Eurasia, and they had to invent farming on their own. They also did not have access to the same technology as the rest of the world. So they had differences in metalworking, for example. In the Americas, they did not develop the wheel. So remember, the wheel was developed in Mesopotamia and diffused throughout Afro-Eurasia, but the Americas did not have access to that. So the first one to be aware of is the Chavín, which is developed along the coast of Peru. They farmed with irrigation, just like we've learned in all other civilizations in the world. Some of their key crops were corn, potatoes, and quinoa. We know that they had extensive culture, religious beliefs. This is ruins of a temple found in Peru. And so key things here again, developed farming independently, polytheistic. Another civilization from this time period in Mesoamerica were the Olmecs. They farmed as well. Foods such as corn, beans, squash, avocados were some of their common crops. And if you think about crops that we associate with this part of the world today, it's very similar. There's archaeological evidence that they traded extensively. They also had monumental architecture, so you can see this huge step pyramid with a religious temple on top. They also developed writing and a calendar. So even though these civilizations were cut off from Afro-Eurasia, they were still very advanced and developed a lot of the same things, just independently. There also were people who spread out throughout Southeast Asia and the South Pacific. So over time, hunter-gatherer people, remember people started in Africa and we looked at the map of how they spread throughout the rest of the world. Eventually, they made it through Asia and over to this region. So you can see Australia here, for example. So they migrated during the Ice Age, probably, through the Pacific Islands to Australia, New Guinea, etc. Now, during the Ice Age, more of the water of the earth was frozen in glaciers and ice, and so the sea level was lower. This meant that there were more land bridges throughout this region, and so it was easier to travel. So like if you look at the top left corner of the map, you can see the purple area, how a lot of those places that are islands today, like in Indonesia, were actually all connected. So that enabled people to migrate a lot easier. Eventually, people made it to New Guinea, and that became another major center of early farming civilizations. Now, just like everywhere else in the world, remember, not everybody who was exposed to farming adopted farming. Some people stayed hunter-gatherers. So, for example, in Australia, the people who are referred to today as Aborigines maintained a hunter-gatherer lifestyle for a long time after that. They chose not to adopt farming. So there's definitely pluses and minuses to both systems. People also started migrating throughout sub-Saharan Africa during this time. One of these groups are called the Bantus. You can see the red circle there is where the Bantus originated in West Africa. And over a few thousand years, they migrated all throughout sub-Saharan Africa. There are three important things that they took with them that formed a lot of the basis of culture of sub-Saharan Africa. Number one, their language. Number two, their knowledge of farming. And number three, their knowledge of ironworking. So language, farming, ironworking. An example of this, if we looked at a map of Africa and the languages that people speak, the vast majority, with the exception of just a few languages in all of sub-Saharan Africa, even though people speak hundreds of different languages, they're all related to Bantu. So this had a lot to do with Africa's future cultural development. So it's important to remember that these civilizations that we talked about did not exist independently of each other. A lot of them traded extensively with others. It's also important to remember that we're studying just a few of the major civilizations. There's lots of other smaller civilizations throughout the world in between these bigger ones. And so trade was a really important thing. Some of these large civilizations, however, did trade with each other, such as Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. We have archaeological evidence that they definitely traded together. Mesopotamia and Egypt definitely traded together. The civilizations of the Americas definitely traded together. And so this is just a little visual review of those major places that we talked about. We have Mesopotamia, Egypt, Indus Valley, and China, New Guinea over here in Southeast Asia, and then the Olmec and the Chauvin in North America and South America. And so if we look at this, which civilizations do you think most commonly traded with each other? You can think about that. And which ones were most isolated? So in terms of most isolated, we could think of which ones were physically cut off and which ones just had very long distances to cover. For example, China is pretty far from Mesopotamia, thousands and thousands of miles. So that is an overview of Paleolithic, Neolithic Revolution, and the first civilizations. So bring those notes to class and we're going to use them in our class activities.